Elias Thorne was an audio forensic specialist, a man paid to find whispers in the roar of jet engines or hidden messages in corrupted black box recordings. He lived in a world of waveforms and decibels, believing that anything strange could be explained by a faulty microphone or radio interference. But then he received the black tapes. They arrived in a nameless package from Oakhaven Sanitarium, a facility that had burned to the ground in 1994. Inside were 12 reel-to-reel tapes and a note. "Don't listen in the dark. The sound is a bridge." Elias set up his equipment in his soundproof basement studio. He hit play. At first, there was only the hiss of aging magnetic tape. But as he increased the gain, he heard a rhythmic thumping. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of someone hitting a wooden door with their forehead. "Is it recording?" A voice whispered. It was a girl's voice, fragile and hollow. "I can hear my own thoughts before I speak them. They're coming out of the vents. They sound like wet static." Suddenly, Elias's high-end monitors spiked into the red. A screeching frequency, so sharp it felt like a needle piercing his brain, filled the room. He reached for the power switch, but his hand froze. The sound wasn't coming from the monitors anymore. It was coming from the walls of his studio. The acoustic foam padding on the walls began to ripple. Elias watched in horror as the shape of a human face pushed through the foam from the other side. Not a physical face, but a face made of vibrating air. It had no eyes, only a wide, screaming mouth that emitted the exact same frequency as the tape. "Who's there?" Elias shouted, his own voice sounding strange to his ears, delayed by a fraction of a second. There. The walls echoed, but the echo didn't fade. It grew louder, distorted, and angry. The tape reel began to spin faster and faster, the brown plastic ribbon glowing with a faint, static blue light. The girl's voice on the recording changed. It was no longer a whisper, it was a command. "Open the door, Elias. I've been screaming in this tape for 30 years, and I'm very, very hungry for a new throat." The basement door slammed shut and locked from the outside. Elias was trapped in a room where the shadows were beginning to hum. The air in the basement had thickened, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that Elias felt in his teeth. He knew this sensation, infrasound, at 19\text hertz, the human I begins to resonate, causing blurred vision and hallucinations of gray ghosts in the periphery. But this wasn't just physics. This was a predator. The face in the foam padding was still there, its mouth a jagged tear in the fabric. It wasn't moving forward. It was waiting. "Speak, Elias," the walls hissed. "Give us a vibration. Give us a bridge." Elias realized the trap. The resonance, the entity trapped within the Oakhaven tapes, was a parasitic sound wave. It lacked a physical form, so it needed the vibrations of a living voice to stitch itself into reality. Every word he spoke, every gasp he let out, provided the raw material for the entity to manifest. He clamped his hand over his mouth. He had to be a ghost. He had to be silence. He reached for his workbench, moving with agonizing slowness. Every scrape of his sleeve against the wood sounded like a thunderclap in the hypersensitive room. The entity reacted to the friction, the foam face stretching toward the sound, its skin shimmering like a heat haze. Suddenly, his phone, sitting on the desk, began to vibrate. It wasn't a call. It was a rhythmic, violent buzzing that skipped across the metal surface. Clatter, clatter, clatter. The sound was like a beacon. A second face pushed through the ceiling, then a third from the floor. They were the silent choir, the spirits of the Oakhaven patients whose voices had been harvested on the tapes. The phone's vibration grew louder, a mechanical scream. The desk began to splinter. Elias watched as the sound waves became visible, shimmering ribbons of distorted air that began to wrap around his ankles like barbed wire. He needed to kill the sound. He grabbed a heavy roll of lead line tape used for shielding cables. With a sudden, desperate movement, he smashed the phone. Crunch! The noise was a mistake. The moment the screen shattered, the ribbons of sound tightened. Elias was jerked off his feet and pinned against the wall. The foam padding surged forward, trying to fill his ears and nose. The frequency shifted from a hum to a deafening roar of 1,000 overlapping screams. "I hear your heart, Elias," the girl's voice from the tape whispered, now sounding as if it were coming from inside his own skull. "It's a beautiful drum. Let's beat it up." His heart began to race, syncing with the violent rhythm of the tapes. He was being overclocked by a sound. If he didn't break the feedback loop, his heart would literally shatter from the resonance. He looked at the reel-to-reel machine. The tape was almost at the end. He reached for the heavy industrial scissors on the rack, but his fingers were numb. Elias lunged for the industrial scissors. His heart was slamming against his ribs at a lethal 180/text BPM, driven by the entity's sonic command. With a final, desperate snip, he sliced through the brown magnetic ribbon. The tape whipped through the air like a dying snake. Silence fell, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of a quiet room. It was a negative silence, a vacuum that sucked the air out of his lungs. The lights in the basement didn't go out. They turned a flat, matte gray. Elias tried to scream in relief, but no sound came out. He watched his own chest heave, heard his own thoughts, but the physical world had stopped transmitting his vibrations. He had entered a phase shift. "I'm dead," he thought. Not dead. A voice vibrated through his bones. It wasn't coming from his ears. Unrecorded. Elias looked at his hands. They were translucent, shimmering like the heat haze on a highway. He stepped toward the basement door and reached for the handle, but his hand passed right through the metal as if it were smoke. He was no longer a solid object. He was a low-frequency ghost. Then he heard it. A heavy, wet thud from the top of the stairs. Thump. Squelch. Something was coming down. It was the Decibel Eater. In this silent dimension, the creature was visible. It was a towering mass of gray, fibrous tissue that looked like a giant inside-out ear. It didn't have eyes or limbs. It moved by expanding and contracting its flesh like a lump. Where a face should be, there was a massive, pulsing diaphragm that acted as a sensory organ. The Decibel Eater was a scavenger of the unrecorded. It hunted the sounds that were lost to history, the screams no one heard, the secrets whispered into the wind. Elias backed away, but even the friction of his feet against the floor, which he couldn't hear, created a visual ripple in this gray world. The Decibel Eater's diaphragm flared. It saw the ripple. It let out a subsonic blast. Elias didn't hear the noise, but the pressure wave hit him like a freight train, tossing his ghostly body across the room. He crashed into his racks of equipment. In the real world, nothing moved. In the gray world, his studio was being torn apart by the monster's search pigs. He realized that in this state, he couldn't fight with his hands. He had to fight with acoustics. He looked at his massive subwoofers. Even though they were off in the physical world, their physical structure existed here. If he could find a way to jumpstart a frequency from the inside, he could create a sonic wall to protect himself. But the Decibel Eater was closing in. Its diaphragm opened wide, revealing rows of vibrating needle teeth. It wasn't going to eat his flesh. It was going to swallow his frequency, erasing him from existence entirely. The Decibel Eater loomed over Elias, its pulsing diaphragm radiating a cold, suffocating pressure. Elias was a fading signal, a ghost in the machine. He could see his physical studio, the workbench, the soldering iron, the half-empty glass of water. But it was like looking at the world through thick, frozen glass. He had to make a sound, not a ghostly thought, but a physical vibration that could cross the phase gap. He lunged toward his desk. His translucent hand passed through the wood, but he noticed that the glass of water reacted. When he moved his hand rapidly through the space where the glass sat, tiny ripples formed on the surface of the water. Kinetic resonance, Elias realized. He couldn't touch the glass, but he could influence the molecular vibration of the liquid. He began to rhythmically swipe his hand through the water. Sosh, sosh, sosh. In the real world, the water began to dance. He wasn't just making ripples. He was trying to tap out a code. SOS. 3 short splashes, 3 long, 3 short. Above him, in the apartment upstairs, lived Clara Valeni, a retired opera soprano. She had spent 40 years mastering the art of the human voice as a physical weapon. She was currently sitting in her kitchen, complaining about the weird hum coming from the floorboards, when she saw the glass on her own table begin to vibrate in sympathy with the basement below. Clara wasn't just a singer. She was an old-school audiophile. She recognized the pattern. "Elias?" she whispered, leaning her ear to the floor. In the basement, the Decibel Eater sensed the ripple. It turned its massive, ear-like head toward the desk. It let out a low, growling frequency that turned the water in the glass to ice instantly. It knew someone was trying to bridge the gap. The monster lunged at the desk, its diaphragm opening to suck in the very concept of Elias's existence. "Now, Clara!" Elias screamed into the void, though no sound left his lips. As if hearing his psychic plea, a piercing, glass-shattering note erupted from above. Clara realized that her neighbor was in mortal danger, had filled her lungs, and hit a high C with the force of a hurricane. The sound wave traveled through the floorboards, through the air, and slammed into the gray world. To Elias, the note looked like a solid wall of golden light. It hit the Decibel Eater like a physical hammer, cracking its gray, fibrous skin. The frequency was so pure, so powerful, that it created a white noise bridge. For a split second, the basement became solid again. Elias felt the weight of his body return. The air rushed into his lungs with a painful sting. "I'm back," he gasped, his voice finally audible. But the bridge was unstable. The Decibel Eater wasn't dead. It was evolving. It began to record Clara's voice, twisting the beautiful operatic note into a distorted, demonic howl. It was using her power to build a permanent doorway into the physical world. Elias saw the monitors in his studio turn back on, but they weren't showing waveforms. They were showing Clara's face, her mouth locked in a silent scream as the entity began to pull her voice and her soul down through the floor. The basement was no longer a room. It was a throat. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the distorted operatic howl of the Decibel Eater. Upstairs, Elias could hear the thud of Clara's body hitting the floor. The entity was sampling her, draining the resonance from her vocal cords until she was nothing but a silent husk. "You want sound?" Elias roared, his voice cracking under the subsonic pressure. "I'll give you everything I've ever recorded." Elias knew the fundamental law of audio engineering: feedback. If a microphone hears what a speaker plays, and that speaker plays what the microphone hears, the sound builds into an infinite self-destructive scream. He scrambled to the back of his rack, his hands trembling as he grabbed a handful of XLR cables. He began to patch his high-gain condenser microphone directly into his primary 10,000-watt amplifier. Then he daisy-chained every monitor, every subwoofer, and every guitar amp in the studio into a single, massive circle. The Decibel Eater sensed the change in the air. Its diaphragm flattened, its needle teeth vibrating with anticipation. It lunged at Elias, but he dived into the center of the speaker's circle, the eye of the storm. He held the microphone to his chest. He didn't speak. He just let the microphone pick up the frantic, rhythmic pounding of his own heart. Thump, 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 thump. The speakers caught the sound and threw it back. The Decibel Eater shrieked, its gray flesh rippling as the heartbeat frequency hit it. Elias turned the gain knob to the maximum. The sound became a physical force. Dust shook from the rafters. The glass in the studio windows disintegrated into fine powder. The thump-thump became a rhythmic explosion that threatened to collapse the house. "Elias, stop!" a voice screamed. It was the girl from the Oakhaven tapes, her face manifesting in the vibrating air right in front of him. "You'll tear your own cells apart." "Good." Elias spat, blood beginning to leak from his ears. "If I go, this frequency goes with me." The feedback loop reached a critical point. The sound waves became so dense, they turned into a visible, shimmering sphere of white static. The Decibel Eater was trapped inside the loop. Its fibrous body began to fray, its flesh unspooling like old magnetic tape. Suddenly, the speakers didn't just play the sound. They began to emit light. The friction of the air molecules moving so fast created a localized plasma. The Decibel Eater let out one final, earth-shaking howl, a composite of every scream it had ever eaten. The feedback loop peaked. A massive pop, like a localized sonic boom, sent a shockwave through the entire neighborhood. Elias was thrown backward, his head hitting the concrete wall. Everything went black. When he opened his eyes, the basement was silent. Not the negative silence of a void, but the heavy, ringing silence of a man who has lost his hearing. The speakers were smoking, their cones melted. The Decibel Eater was gone, leaving behind only a pile of gray, ash-like dust that smelled of ozone and old paper. Elias touched his ears. They were wet with blood. He looked up at the ceiling. The floorboards above were still. "Clara," he tried to say, but he couldn't hear his own voice. He stood up, stumbling toward the stairs. But as he reached the first step, he felt a vibration under his palm on the railing. It was a rhythmic tapping. Short, short, short. Long, long, long. Short, short, short. It wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from inside the wood of the banister. Elias sat on the basement stairs, his head spinning. The world was deathly quiet, yet his skull felt like a beehive. The high-pitched ringing, what doctors call tinnitus, wasn't a steady tone. It was a jagged, electronic chirping that pulsed behind his eyes. He climbed the stairs to Clara's apartment. He found her slumped against the kitchen counter, breathing but unconscious. Her throat was bruised, a purple ring around her neck where her voice had been extracted. As Elias reached out to help her, the ringing in his ears spiked. It became a frantic, rhythmic staccato. Dod, dod, dod. Dash, dash, dash. Dod, dod, dod. SOS, Elias whispered. He didn't hear his voice, but he felt the vibration in his throat. He realized the ash downstairs wasn't the monster's remains. It was a conductor. The feedback loop hadn't destroyed the resonance. It had shattered it into millions of tiny data shards, and they had found the only receiver left in the room, Elias's own nervous system. He stumbled back to his studio and grabbed a pen. He began to write down the patterns of the ringing. It wasn't Morse code anymore. It was binary. 01001000, 01000101, 01001100, 01010000. Ashu Elpi. The ringing grew louder, turning into a multi-layered choir of whispers. They weren't coming from the air. They were vibrating his auditory nerve directly. "Thank you for the storage, Elias," a voice hummed, the girl from the Oakhaven tapes. The tapes were so cold. Your brain is so warm. So much room for our memories. Elias looked in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, and he could see the veins in his neck pulsing in time with the tinnitus. He wasn't just hearing the Oakhaven patients. He was becoming the archive. Suddenly, his hand moved on its own. It grabbed a soldering iron from the desk. He watched, a spectator in his own body, as his hand began to carve a waveform into the wooden surface of the workbench. It was the architectural layout of the Oakhaven Sanitarium. "We need to go back, Elias," the collective voices hissed in his brain. The fire in 1994 didn't finish the recording. There's a master tape buried in the sub-basement. If you play it, we can all finally go. "Ow, I won't do it," Elias thought, gritting his teeth. The ringing shifted. It became a brown note frequency, a sound that causes the human body to lose control of its muscles and organs. Elias collapsed to the floor, his vision blurring. The entity was using his own biological hardware to torture him into submission. He realized that if he didn't find a way to format his own mind, these thousands of lost, angry souls would burn his brain out like a blown fuse. He looked at his computer. It was still on. He reached for the keyboard, his fingers twitching. He needed to find a frequency that could wipe a human brain without killing it. He needed the silence of the grave. The ruins of Oakhaven Sanitarium stood like a jagged, blackened tooth against the moonlight. The air here didn't just feel cold. It felt thin, as if the sounds of the natural world, the wind in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, were being filtered through a thick layer of gauze. Inside Elias's head, the choir of Oakhaven was ecstatic. The ringing in his ears had turned into a frantic, rhythmic chanting. The room. Find a room. The silence is waiting. Elias stumbled through the charred hallways, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick soot. He wasn't looking for a master tape. He was looking for the anechoic vault. According to the blueprints he had carved into his desk, Oakhaven hadn't just been a hospital. It had been an experimental facility for acoustic isolation therapy. He found a heavy, lead-lined door in the sub-basement, beneath the level where the fire had reached. The door was marked with a symbol of a crossed-out ear. As he stepped inside, the sensation was physical. It felt like his head had been plunged into a vat of oil. This was an anechoic chamber, a room lined with deep, wedge-shaped fiberglass foam that absorbed 99.9% of all sound. In a room like this, a person can hear their own blood flowing and their lungs expanding. Finally, Elias whispered. He didn't hear his voice, but the vibration in his chest felt like a lifeline. And oh, the voices in his head screamed. The sudden lack of external echoes was agonizing for the residents. Without a physical medium to bounce off of, the entities were forced to compress themselves entirely within Elias's neural pathways. He sat in the center of the room, pulling a portable signal generator from his bag. He had programmed it to emit a negative phase pulse. It was designed to detect a frequency and immediately emit the exact opposite wave, canceling the sound into absolute zero. If I do this, Elias thought, it won't just erase them. It'll wipe my own auditory memory. I might never hear music again. I might never hear Claire's voice. Don't, please. The girl's voice pleaded. It was no longer a command. It was a whimper. If we vanish, no one will know we ever existed. We will be the never heard. Elias looked at the generator. He felt a moment of pity. These were people, victims of an experiment that had turned their screams into a haunting. But they were a virus now, and he was the host. He dialed the frequency to the exact pitch of his tinnitus. As he reached for the activate button, the shadows in the room began to solidify. Because the room was so silent, the resonance was using the electrical signals in Elias's own nerves to create a visual projection. A dozen figures appeared, flickering like old television static. They were the patients. Their mouths were sewn shut with copper wire, their eyes replaced by speaker cones. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to plug themselves into him. "I'm sorry," Elias said. He pressed the button. The negative phase pulse didn't just stop the ringing. It punched a hole in the universe. When Elias pressed the button, there was no sound. Instead, a shockwave of absolute zero light rippled outward. The signal generator didn't just cancel the noise. It canceled the distance between sounds. Elias felt his body stretch like a pulled string, and then he was elsewhere. He was still in the anechoic chamber, but it had transformed. The fiberglass wedges were no longer foam. They were made of solid, crystallized obsidian. In this place, sound had physical weight. Every breath Elias took fell to the floor like a handful of heavy coins. Every heartbeat sent a visible ripple across the ground like a stone dropped in a dark pond. "Pick up your noise, boy. It's messy," a voice rasped. Standing in the corner was a man who looked like he was carved from a block of gray salt. He wore a lab coat that was stiff with age, and his eyes were covered by thick lead glass goggles. "Dr. Elias Thorne?" Elias gasped. His own grandfather, the man who had supposedly died in the Oakhaven fire. "I didn't die, Elias," the old man said, his voice sounding like two grinding rocks. "I simply moved to the null space. I realized that the resonance, the spirits you've been fighting, weren't the predators. They were the acoustic insulation." Elias looked at the shadows of the Oakhaven patients. They were huddled against the obsidian walls, their speaker cone eyes wide with terror. They weren't attacking, they were hiding. "Insulation against what?" Elias asked, his voice falling to the floor in heavy, leaden clumps. Dr. Thorne pointed his salt-crusted finger upward. "The primordial scream. Before there was light, there was a vibration. A sound so loud and so chaotic that it couldn't exist in a universe with matter. It's been trying to get back in for billions of years. It uses the quiet moments, the gaps between heartbeats, to pry its way through." Suddenly, the obsidian walls began to crack, not from a blow, but from a pressure that felt like the weight of a mountain. A sound began to leak through the cracks. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a frequency. It was a white-hot static, a noise so dense it felt like molten lead being poured into Elias's ears. It was the sound of stars collapsing and galaxies tearing apart. The resonance was a choir that kept the scream at bay. Dr. Thorne yelled over the rising roar. By trying to erase the ghosts, you thinned the walls of reality. The absolute zero you created is a vacuum, and the scream is rushing in to fill it. The obsidian wedges began to vibrate so violently they turned into a blur. One by one, the Oakhaven spirits were sucked toward the cracks, their static forms being torn apart by the raw power of the Primordial Scream. How do we stop it? Elias screamed, his throat bleeding from the effort. You can't stop a sound that never ends, the doctor laughed, his salt skin beginning to flake away. You can only drown it. You need a sound louder than the beginning of time. The Primordial Scream was no longer just a sound. It was a physical erasure. Where the white-hot static touched the obsidian walls, the world simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a terrifying, non-existent void. Dr. Thorne was gone, his salt body pulverized into dust by the first wave of the cosmic roar. Elias stood alone at the center of the crumbling vault. His eardrums had long since shattered, yet he heard the scream in his very marrow. It was the sound of a universe being unmade. I have to drown it, Elias whispered. But how do you outshout the voice of the Big Bang? He realized that the scream was pure entropy, chaos without a pattern. To fight it, he didn't need volume. He needed harmony. He needed a frequency that represented the opposite of the void. The messy, beautiful, rhythmic pulse of life itself. Elias closed his eyes and reached out to the resonance shards still embedded in his nervous system. He didn't try to erase them this time. Instead, he beckoned them. He used his training as a forensic specialist to tune them. Clara, he thought, picturing the opera's singer. The neighbors, the city. He began to hum. It wasn't a melody. It was a vibrational anchor. He channeled the electrical energy of his own brain into his vocal cords, turning his entire body into a biological tuning fork. As he hummed, the storage in his mind, the thousands of Oakhaven souls began to vibrate in unison with him. They were no longer a chaotic choir. They were a single, focused beam of sound. The hum crossed the null space and began to resonate with every living heart in the city above. In London, people woke up in their beds, feeling a strange, comforting warmth in their chests. They didn't know why, but they began to hum too. A million heartbeats, a million breaths, all sinking into one massive planetary aum. The Primordial Scream hit the hum and recoiled. The white-hot static flickered. The obsidian walls of the vault began to stabilize, the cracks sealing shut with a golden, vibrating light. Elias felt his skin begin to glow. The pressure was immense. He was the grounding wire for a billion souls. Elias, you're burning out, the girl's voice whispered, now clear and calm. The human body isn't meant to hold this much music. If you stay as the tuning fork, you will become the sound itself. You will never be a man again. I know, Elias thought. The Primordial Scream let out a final, desperate roar, trying to shatter the harmonic shield. Elias pushed back, his hum rising to a crescendo that felt like his soul was being pulled through a needle's eye. The vault exploded in a flash of sonic plasma. The explosion wasn't a blast of fire, but a burst of pure silence. When the golden light faded, the sub-basement of Oakhaven was gone. There were no obsidian walls, no salt-crusted doctors, and no screaming ghosts. There was only a perfectly circular crater of white dust, where the air itself felt heavy and still. Elias Thorne had vanished. 3 months later, in a high-tech recording studio in downtown London, a young audio engineer named Sarah was working on a film score. She was using the most sensitive microphones ever built, designed to capture the quietest sounds on Earth. While cleaning a track, she noticed something impossible. Even in a vacuum-sealed, soundproof room, there was a constant, microscopic vibration. When she zoomed in on the waveform, it didn't look like static. It looked like a perfect sine wave. "That's weird," she whispered. She ran the signal through a frequency analyzer. It was a steady 432 \text hertz hum, the frequency of a universe. But embedded within that hum was a data signal. She slowed it down by 1000% and played it back through her monitors. "I am the wall. I am the wire. Keep singing." It was a voice, Elias's voice, interwoven with the voices of 1,000 others. He hadn't died. He had become the atmospheric varnish. He was the permanent hum that sat between the world and the primordial scream. But Sarah soon realized the price of this protection. She walked out into the London streets and noticed a strange phenomenon. People were happier, calmer, but they were also quieter. No one shouted. No one laughed loudly. It was as if the entire city was subconsciously afraid to break the silence. She looked at a street performer playing a violin. The music was beautiful, but as the performer hit a particularly high, sharp note, a visible ripple of black static appeared in the air for a fraction of a second. The hum immediately surged, suppressing the ripple, but Sarah saw the truth. The primordial scream wasn't gone. It was a tide, and Elias was the levee. But every time humanity made a loud, chaotic noise, a scream of anger, a roar of an engine, a blast of a horn, it put a crack in Elias. Sarah went back to her studio and looked at the waveform again. She saw that the Elias signal was fraying. To keep the scream out, the world had to stay harmonic. Suddenly, her monitor spiked. The SOS pattern appeared on her screen in flickering green lines. "Sarah," the speakers breathed. "I can't hold the silence forever." They're learning to mimic the hum. They're learning to hide inside the music. Sarah looked at her own reflection in the studio glass. Her mouth opened, but instead of her own voice, a low-frequency chirping came out. A shard of the resonance was already inside her, waiting for the moment the tuning fork finally broke. The world was safe for now, but the age of the great silence had begun. And in the silence, the monsters don't need to scream to be heard. They only need to wait for you to stop humming.